Hello, and welcome back to the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum Virtual Speaker Series, where we have paleontology guests call in for a presentation on science, fossils, and dinosaurs, and where the public will be able to ask questions live on YouTube. First off, we want to acknowledge that we are on the homeland of the many diverse First Nations and Métis people whose ancestors have walked this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to work, live, and learn on the traditional territory of Treaty 8. Today, Dr. Thomas Holtz is joining us from Maryland, USA to present his talk, Teen Tyrants in a Gig Ecology, Tyrannosaurid Ontogenetic Niche Shifts in Light of Theropod Guild History. Dr. Thomas Holtz received his bachelor's at Johns Hopkins University in 1987 and his PhD from Yale University in 1992. His work is concentrated on the evolution and adaptations of carnivorous dinosaurs, with a special focus on Tyrannosauria, T-Rex and its kin. He is a principal lecturer in vertebrate paleontology with the Department of Geology at the University of Maryland, and a research associate with the Department of Paleobiology in the National Museum of Natural History. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Holtz, and with that, I'll let you take it away.
Great, and thank you for having me out here. Of course, I wish I could be at the Currie Museum in person. I have yet to actually visit the museum and really look forward to getting there sometime. But in this day of the pandemic, we do what we can to help each other out. And quite frankly, it's been a really good situation in one way for museums and universities and so forth, in that there's a lot more opportunity for cooperation and invitation of guest speakers on essentially a minuscule budget. And you don't have to worry about airfare and so forth, and quite frankly, better carbon footprint that way. So glad to be able to speak about some of my favorite things, which are tyrannosaurs. So well, maybe I can't use the laser pointer here. Let me just keep it on an ordinary cursor then. There we go. So the work I'm talking about today is primarily focused on a paper I have coming out in the very near future, hopefully later this month, on theropod guild structure and the Tyrannosaurid niche assimilation hypothesis. This work is coming out in a special tribute volume of the Canadian Journal of Earth Sciences in honor of Dale Russell. Dale was a phenomenal paleontologist and a great innovator and speculator of many different ideas. And I have to say, personally, both Dale Russell and Phil Currie are and were great helps to me early in my career, and I like to think of them as friends. We miss Dale, and I'm glad to be part of this volume coming out honoring his work. I also have to say that many of the conclusions that I discuss, particularly in the later part of this presentation, were independently derived in a new analysis that came out at the beginning of this year by Schrader and colleagues, looking with a slightly different data set and a slightly different approach, but coming with a very similar set of conclusions, which quite frankly is encouraging when different teams of researchers working independently, using different data sets come to similar conclusions. That's pretty good support to the possibility that those ideas are in fact accurate. All right, so I would say tyrannosaurids need no introduction, but hey, they're tyrannosaurs. They deserve one anyway. So Tyrannosaurus Rex is of course the most famous species of dinosaur in the world, and indeed the only species of animal alive or extinct that everyone always gets the name correct. Because you'll find lots of people who refer to our own species as Homo sapien, which is not what we are. We are Homo sapiens. That S at the end is not a plural. Tyrannosaurus Rex, though, people get right. And Tyrannosaurus is just one of several genera of this group, Tyrannosauridae. The Tyrannosaurids have been known since the earliest 1900s and are a characteristic group of gigantic predatory dinosaurs, primarily found in Western North America and Eastern and Central Asia from the later part of the late Cretaceous. But Tyrannosaurids, that is the group Tyrannosauridae, is just one clade that is one branch within a long family tree of a group called Tyrannosauroidea. And over the course of time, Tyrannosaurs developed, or Tyrannosaurs in general developed larger and larger heads, which became proportionally and absolutely, which became much more the organ both for acquiring prey and for dispatching it. At the same time, with the forelimb becoming less important, so that ancestral tyrannosauroids had perfectly good, long, grasping arms with three-fingered hands, but eventually you get the shortened limb, the shortened arm, famous for plenty of jokes and cartoons. And something less appreciated is that as we get to tyrannosaurids and their closest relatives, we get increasing focus in the hind limb on what we broadly call cursoriality, which means running ability. Although, as I'll be addressing later on, running ability might mean more than absolute speed, at least at certain sizes. And here is a relatively recent family tree, and this is tilted on its side from the way I showed before, scaled against time along the bottom, of the tyrannosauroids who first appear way back in the Jurassic and spent most of their history as secondary members of the carnivorous guild, that is the assemblage of carnivores, in the shadow of much larger allosauroids and megalosauroids and so forth. And it's within this group that eventually you evolve the clade Tyrannosauridae. So these forms down here still had very long arms, and these late Cretaceous forms, Tyrannosauridae and its immediate close relatives, had relatively short arms and also much larger body size. To look at the world of the late Cretaceous, we find tyrannosaurids as part of an assemblage in this landmass that includes Western North America, or Laramidia, as it's called, and Eastern and Central Asia. Collectively, this landmass is called Asia America, and the stretch of land between Alaska and Siberia, much as it was in the age of mammals, was occasionally above water and occasionally below. And that allowed the exchange of animals back and forth over the Bering, what we now call the Bering Straits, or the region of Beringia. So some of the other animals that characterize the Asian American fauna are the famous horned dinosaurs, like Triceratops and Centrosaurus and Pachyrhinosaurus, a huge diversity of duckbill dinosaurs. This is also the region in which you find the dome-headed pachycephalosaurs and the club-tailed ankylosaurids. Now, in my part of North America, in the Mesozoic, or the Cretaceous at least, referred to as Appalachia, we had early branching members of the giant tyrannosaurids, things like Dryptosaurus and Appalachosaurus, as well as duckbill or duckbill relatives on our side. Now, the exposures of Cretaceous rocks are far less extensive in Eastern North America. We don't have the Great Badlands that we do in the American and Canadian West. So the fossil discoveries are far less numerous, but we see that there is an assemblage similar to, but distinct from, Asia America. These landmasses were indeed separated for most of this history by a shallow seaway that ran from what's currently the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the Arctic Ocean. Now, most of the rest of the world, which one might call, and people have called, Euro-Gondwana, has a relatively similar fauna from the archipelago of Europe down to southern South America and Australasia. And this is a landmass in which the dominant predators were not tyrannosaurs of any sort, but rather a group called the abelisaurids, and in which, instead of a diverse group of Ornithischian, that is bird-hipped herbivores, the most numerous and ecologically dominant group of herbivores were the Titanosaur sauropods. All right, so when we think of Tyrannosaurus Rex and other tyrannosaurids, we picture them as these enormous, gigantic organisms. And of course, they're impressive in that state, but they didn't emerge that way out of nowhere, either evolutionarily or in ontogeny, in their own growth history. They didn't emerge as full-grown 12 to 13 meter individuals like Sue or Scotty here. They came from eggs. They came from little babies. And indeed, we do have fossils of various growth stages in between. So here are two different specimens. This is Scotty, and this is a much smaller individual from the Frenchman Formation of Saskatchewan. And this is a reconstructed skull of both this youngster and of the giant individual, Scotty. Now, when you find these little individuals, there was a tendency in the earlier days of dinosaur history to regard all differences as being taxonomic. That is, when you found a specimen that looked different from another, you assumed it was a member of a different species. And this tradition goes way back in the days of paleontology, and even in the 1950s, as the dinosaurs of Mongolia were being described by teams from the Soviet Union, a series of fossils of tyrannosaurs were described by Maliev here in a couple of papers in 1955, and he described each of these different sizes as its own distinct species, two as new species of the same genus as many North American dinosaurs, Gorgosaurus, one as a new species of Tyrannosaurus, and one intermediate in size as Tarbosaurus. Now, anytime we put a name on a fossil, that's a hypothesis. It is a speculation as to its identity relative to previous discoveries, and as such is subject to falsification and reanalysis by other workers. Maliev considered the smaller Nemegt formation, and that's the name of the formation in which they're found, specimens, as being distinct species from the larger ones on a number of aspects. The smaller ones had more slender jaws, they had a higher tooth count, their teeth were much thinner, they were more blade-like and less thick. They had different forelimb proportions than the large forms, they had different hind limb proportions than the adult forms. Of course, an alternative hypothesis is that these are not separate species. And indeed, Rojdestvenski, one of Maliev's colleagues, would, in a very influential paper in the 1960s, reevaluate this and said, no, these are not four different species living side by side in the same environment. This is a growth series of one species for which the proper name would be Tarbosaurus batar. Now, for some of you out there who are more familiar with more recent episodes of the history of Tyrannosaur studies, that should sound awfully familiar. Because in the last several decades, specimens within the Hell Creek Formation of Western North America of medium-sized tyrannosaurs have been given the name Nanotyrannus lancensis. The type-bearing specimen is this beautiful skull at the Cleveland Museum. The best studied and most complete described, or at least in the midst of being described specimen is this one at the Burpee Museum, and given the nickname Jane. And the best potential specimen recently acquired by the North Carolina State Museum and the North Carolina Science Museum and the North Carolina North Carolina State University, where it's currently being prepared and will be the subject of plenty of analysis. These were all thought by some workers to represent its own distinct species. And the argument said that Nanotyrannus was distinct from Tyrannosaurus by having more slender jaws, higher tooth count, more blade-like teeth, different forelimbs. These sound awfully familiar, don't they? Yeah, so we've been through this before. But it is true that these teenaged individuals of Tyrannosaur, whether we're talking about Mongolian or North American, do look different than the giant adult forms. And that actually is not insignificant, as we will see. Now, Dale Russell, in a very influential paper in 1970 on Tyrannosaurs of North America, speculated on what a hatchling tyrannosaur would look like. And up until extremely recently, we didn't have any direct evidence of hatchling tyrannosaurs. This was his interpretation based on the growth trajectories of the different proportions of the body among older individuals and then extrapolating back to a youngster. Now, if you saw Dr. Greg Funston's presentation for the virtual speaker series last month, you'll see that he described new specimens that have been found that do represent hatchling or maybe even embryonic individuals of tyrannosaurs. And although nothing complete yet, are tantalizingly similar to the proportions that, that Russell suggested. And you can see, I present here the link to the YouTube video, but if you're finding this video later on YouTube to watch it, I'm sure just check out the rest of the channel and you will find Dr. Funston's talk. Now, as dinosaurs, they had a lot of growing up to do. In fact, let me back up a slide here. You could see that these individuals, in showing a hatchling size compared to an adult, there is a lot of changes they go through in terms not only proportion, but of course in size and in ecology. Now, it has been speculated, for instance, based on discoveries by Currie and colleagues at Dry Island, that perhaps younger individuals of tyrannosaurids operated with older individuals in a group environment, a pack-like situation. And that is indeed theoretically possible, but we don't have evidence for this in all species of tyrannosaurids. And indeed, even in modern animals, we can find extremely closely related species, like say tigers and lions, where one of them is a solitary hunter and the other one is a hunter in prides. So we wouldn't necessarily infer pack hunting in all tyrannosaurids. And indeed, it's very likely, in fact, it might be expected to be the default, that although there was probably parental care of the young in tyrannosaurids for at least the first several weeks or maybe months, perhaps even a year or so of life, as there are in both the extant birds, of course, the living part of the dinosaurian tree, and the dinosaurs' next closest living relatives, which are the crocodilians. And here you see a gavial dad, you can tell because of the gara, or swelled nose expansion, and a whole flock of his babies hanging out with him. That after several weeks, most crocodilians abandon their young. And from that point on, those young have to fend for themselves. But of course, a little baby gavial is not going to be ecologically the same sort of animal as a great big daddy. And similarly, in other reptiles that go through tremendous size changes for which there's no parental care, like a Komodo monitor, there is a tremendous change of lifestyle between the youngsters, which are arboreal, that is tree-dwelling animals, and the adults, which of course are the fearsome Komodo dragon on the ground, a predator on large-bodied mammals. And so we would expect that tyrannosaurids going through these tremendous size changes and presumably not having parents or other adults provisioning them for particularly long, maybe weeks, maybe months, who knows, maybe a few years, that they still would have to have some other way of making a living between their early days and their adulthood, let's say their permanent final job. So did tyrannosaurids have a part-time job in a gig ecology? Well, one thing we can do to interpret how a younger tyrannosaur operated in its ecology compared to the adult is see how they differ. And so I'm going to take us through a number of attributes that are relevant to food acquisition, to prey acquisition, that vary greatly between the adult forms of tyrannosaurids and their younger, say, juvenile and teenage stage. One of these, of course, is bite forces. Tyrannosaurid bite force has attracted a lot of attention because the expectation is with these enormous skulls, with this greatly expanded rear part of the jaw, with huge openings for jaw muscles, and for their tremendously deep and thickened teeth, that tyrannosaurids would have very powerful bites. That's the expectation. A number of different research teams have explored that. This represents one of the most recent examinations of it, where they looked at the overall bite strength and the pressure generation at the tips of individual teeth. And this team found that the bite force of a large Tyrannosaurus Rex is something on the order of 35.5, let's round it up to 35 kilonewtons, which is more than twice the bite force of the living Crocodylus porosus, the giant saltwater crocodile of Australasia. And you can see down here comparisons of this bite force to some living animals, so dwarfing the bite force of a great white shark or a spotted hyena, or of course our own bite force. But to be fair, and as a tyrannosaur worker, I don't like to admit this, but I do have to admit this as a good scientist, it's itself dwarfed by the estimates for the bite of giant crocodilians, like the Cenozoic era Purosaurus, or the giant shark, Otodus megalodon or Caracalis megalodon, whatever genus you want to put that in. But that's for the adults. It was found in various estimates that juvenile tyrannosaurs, in different studies, had a much smaller bite force than the big adults. So for instance, the specimen Jane had a bite force only about a tenth the strength of a big individual like Sue or Scotty. Well, what about the forelimbs? The forelimbs of tyrannosaurids are proverbially ridiculously small. It's been the subject of cartoons and jokes for decades. This is the original one. So, what tyrannosaurs are doing eating potatoes, I don't know. But yeah, plenty of cartoons out there. This is just a smattering, a small section of my collection of Tyrannosaur short-armed cartoons or animated GIFs. And it's true, the tiny little forelimbs of tyrannosaurs cannot reach their jaws. They couldn't pick their own teeth with them. They could only scratch their chin if they retracted the skull all the way, and the hands couldn't even clap together. They're too far apart as adults. And that's a thing. Tyrannosaurs weren't adults their whole life. In fact, as we'll see later on, tyrannosaurs were, in fact, adults only a little bit of their life, and most of the rest of their life, their limbs were proportionately larger. So here is Jane. And although these arms are by no means anywhere near as elongate and good grasping limbs as we saw in early tyrannosauroids, they're still potentially more functional in prey acquisition or perhaps some other behaviors than those of the adult tyrannosaurids. And here we see by comparison the humerus, that is the upper arm bone of Jane, versus that of the giant specimen Sue, who is about 10 times as massive. And here similarly, this is the type specimen, that is the name-bearing specimen of Tyrannosaurus Rex. And you can see how tiny those arms, they're not going to get anywhere near those jaws. Well, what about the hind limbs? The hind limbs of tyrannosaurids similarly go through changes, although perhaps not quite as dramatic. So here we have an adult specimen of the earlier Tyrannosaurid Gorgosaurus, and here is a subadult specimen, a teenager. Now, in general, tyrannosaurids have limbs which are longer and more slender than other members of the carnivorous dinosaur group, that is the theropods as a whole. In fact, the foot of most theropods is relatively broad. So here's the foot of Allosaurus, and here's one of the Abelisaurid Majungasaurus. And in comparison, tyrannosaurids have narrow, compressed feet, what I named in my dissertation the arctometatarsus, or constrained foot structure. It's important to note that tyrannosaurids are not unique in having this sort of foot structure. For instance, their contemporaries, the ornithomimids or ostrich dinosaurs, had an identical foot structure. And we could see that in a young individual, like here's a young individual, here's Jane again, and here's an even smaller individual of Tyrannosaur from the Frenchman Formation of Saskatchewan. And in fact, at these sizes, they resemble those feet of ornithomimids extremely closely, to the point that this was interpreted as being an ornithomimid foot until later work showed no, in fact, it's a tyrannosaur. And here we can see two different specimens, a tyrannosaurid and an ornithomimid, on display at the LA County Museum to see some of these similarities in proportions. So, in fact, you know, in science, it's better to not simply just look at something and say that's kind of similar, but quantify it if possible. So just to remind you of the basics of hind limb anatomy, the femur is the thigh bone, the tibia is the shin bone, and the metatarsus are the long bones of the foot. And so here's a plot of a great number of metatarsi, long bones of the feet, versus femur length of a bunch of theropods. And in these reddish or umber, I suppose, squares are tyrannosaurids. Here are the ornithomimids, the ostrich dinosaurs that have a similar foot structure. And we see that the metatarsi of tyrannosaurids are proportionally a lot longer than those of other large-bodied theropods like Carcharodontosaurus or Giganotosaurus or the like. And that teenage tyrannosaurs have the same limb proportions, or essentially the same limb proportions, as the ostrich dinosaurs, as the ornithomimids. Now, it would be great if we could take some measurements of limb bones, run them through an equation, and get the actual speed of animals. But we're not at that stage in paleontology, and quite frankly, we're not at that stage in biology. No one has yet shown that there are just a small number of morphological observations and measurements you can take to predict maximum speed of a living animal, much less a fossil one. So what we have to rely on are tracks. And the issue here is that we don't always get the tracks we want. For instance, a track surface, if it's going to fossilize, has to be sloppy enough that it's taking the impression of a foot. A drier surface, which might be better for running at higher speeds, is not going to form a surface on which you can make fossilizable tracks. We actually do have a couple of cases where there are tyrannosaur tracks that represent probable teen or young adult individuals. So here's one from northwestern British Columbia, where this sequence of tracks is estimated to represent an individual of about a 2.3 meter height, and moving at speeds about 6.4 to 8.5 kilometers an hour. So not racehorse speed by any means, but that's not a bad clip for a nice walk. And a smaller individual in the Lance Formation of Wyoming, an individual actually just about the size of Jane, moving at about 8.1 to 12.5 kilometers an hour. So I wish we could then give you speed estimates for adult individuals of tyrannosaurids, but sadly we don't have those tracks yet. But it's worth noting that there's more to cursoriality, that is adaptations for running, than maximum attained speed. And that is an aspect of cursoriality. Of course, it's a very important one, but so is acceleration. And so is your home range. So elongation of the hind limb might give you a larger home range, as can do non-speed related adaptations, like adaptations for certain types of habitats or feeding styles, or who knows what else. And one of the aspects of cursoriality and locomotion is agility. And in the last several years, I was glad to be part of a project that actually attempted to examine the agility of different types of large-bodied theropods, including tyrannosaurids. So as you can see, it was quite a large team of scientists working on this with a number of different backgrounds and approaches. And our basic question was, how did tyrannosaurids, and here's T-Rex indicated, compared to a bunch of other large-bodied theropods, how did their agility compare to that of other big theropods? And by agility, we're looking at angular acceleration. That is the torque they could generate relative to their rotational inertia, that is the resistance to being turned. Now, in order to estimate this, how are we going to figure this out? Well, first thing we wanted to do was estimate rotational inertia. And the way to do that is to treat a dinosaur like a sausage. That is to take some scale model, or in this case, multiple views of illustrated reconstructed skeletons, and mathematically turn it into a series of sausage slices, and then get an estimate of the volume of each of these individual frustra or slices. For these slices, we approximated what the expected density would be at each part of the body. And you can see the various measurements here. The trunk of theropod dinosaurs was quite hollow in many ways. This is a region in which the bones are often filled with air sacs, where the body volume was occupied by lungs and also additional respiratory air sacs. The head, although it's got plenty of air sacs, particularly in Tyrannosaurs, is also occupied by a heck of a lot of bone. Most of the tail and so forth, quite a muscly region. And so these are the densities that we used. So we take that, integrate that over the whole body, and that gives us its resistance to being turned. Now, in order to estimate the torque that was being generated, we needed to estimate the size of the muscles involved and their forces. The main muscles involved are attached to the ilium, that is the upper bone in the hip, as well as the catofemoralis longus, this huge muscle that runs from the femur onto the tail. We had a couple different estimates of the size of these muscles based on different approximations by different researchers. We also looked at a couple different scenarios on how the animal might be turning. Was it turning on just a single leg? So is it pirouetting on a single leg, or with both legs planted? And then the members of the team who were far more mathematically oriented than I am did the calculations, and they compared these values against body mass. And here we can see how the agility moment was calculated. And we found that the Tyrannosaurids, shown here in blue, were typically twice the agility index volume of other large theropods of the same size. So here we can see, for instance, this is the specimen Jane of Tyrannosaurus Rex compared to Ceratosaurus nasocornus, a famous late Jurassic form. And in fact, here we can see these are juvenile or teen Gorgosaurus, Tyrannosaurus, and Tarbosaurus versus larger individuals over here. So the main point of our study at the time was to compare Tyrannosaurids to the apparently less turning ability of typical theropod dinosaurs, but we can also see that the younger individuals are far more agile than the big adults. Not unexpected, but it's good to actually show it mathematically. I just want to point out here that Tyrannosaurs being able to turn more quickly than other big theropods makes reasonable sense in terms of their ecology, because many of the prey items in the Tyrannosaurid community were more agile and potentially better defended than those in the Jurassic and early Cretaceous. That is, the duckbills, the horned dinosaurs, and the club-tailed ankylosaurids may represent themselves more agile prey items than did these big walking walls of meat that are sauropods and the stegosaurs. Now, on a converse aspect of it, it might also make more sense that a theropod that's habitually going after a sauropod dinosaur might need a more stable base in order to inflict the appropriate wounds. Another aspect of cursoriality, though, is the cost of locomotion. And in a study in a team I was working with colleagues last year, or that came out last year, I should say, we were working on it for a while before then, is to look at whether the limb lengthening that we see in certain types of theropod dinosaurs was more closely associated with increased speed ability or with some other factor. And so we looked at a number of different sizes of dinosaurs, a number of different estimates of speed. You can see different speed estimate approaches give us different sort of trends as we get to the larger individuals in particular. And we can see here some modern animals superimposed at their appropriate speeds and sizes to get a sense of what's going on here. And we found that for large individual theropods, that is those greater than 1 ton, longer legs gave only a marginal increase in maximum speed. It gave some, but only a little increase, but it really helped by decreasing the total cost of transport, and therefore decreased the energy demands of the larger individuals. So one could think that perhaps the elongated limbs of tyrannosaurids relative to allosauroids and ceratosaurs and megalosauroids and so forth may have been an adaptation to be more efficient. But of course, they didn't evolve only at 1 ton sizes. Evolution occurs to the whole animal, and these 1 ton individuals were 100 kilogram individuals and 10 kilogram individuals and 2 kilogram individuals at various points in their ecology. And indeed, at smaller body size, at less than 1 ton, longer hind limbs does show a marked increase in overall estimated body speed. So as we pointed out, the smaller individuals, longer legs are better for sprinting. Larger individuals, longer legs was better for marathoning. And therefore, a Jane-sized or smaller individual of Tyrannosaurid might have a much more benefit in terms of its overall speed and therefore perhaps the types of prey it can acquire. Whereas an older individual like Scotty or Sue may not be able to go anywhere near as fast, but could use this adaptation to be more efficient in the pursuit of presumably slower large prey. And so, yeah, for instance, here is Scotty and here is Sue for comparison. And indeed, that really is probably the big difference in their ecologies, that large-bodied tyrannosaurids were presumably feeding predominantly on large-bodied prey, things like duckbills and horned dinosaurs and ankylosaurids. And here we see from the Hell Creek Formation, Tyrannosaurus Rex, the apex predator of that environment, scaled in size with the 3 representatives of those clades in its formation. Now, adult tyrannosaurids might have had a difficult time in acquiring small-bodied prey, particularly small-bodied prey on the 1 to 2 meter scale on a habitual basis. Whereas a juvenile specimen of Tyrannosaurus, like Jane here, is ideally suited in terms of size and in terms of adaptations. You wouldn't need the massive bone-crushing jaws of a Sue or Scotty to take out a Leptoceratops or a Thescelosaurus or an Ornithomimus, but a much more agile and fast-moving predator would be required to be able to take down rather fast-moving and agile prey. And then when you look at the suite of predatory dinosaurs as a whole from the Hell Creek Formation, we see a pattern here. These are the best known. In fact, these are essentially all the Hell Creek Formation, as the upper part of the Hell Creek Formation theropods, with Tyrannosaurus and an adult shown here as the dominant one. And we see there's a number of intermediate forms in terms of size, but it's worth noting all of these show adaptations that suggest that the flesh of dinosaurs was not their habitual food. Some were insectivores, some were herbivores, some may have been omnivores, but with adaptations specializing on very small prey items, mammals, lizards, baby dinosaurs, and the like. And so we see this pattern of a number of small-bodied predators, and then a size jump to a gigantic predator like Tyrannosaurus Rex. It's worth noting here too that Dakotaraptor, which is the only real medium-sized predator here, is known from vanishingly few specimens, and indeed did not show up at all in many big census studies of Hell Creek or Hell Creek and Lance Formation studies based on assemblages from historical collections. So Dakotaraptor appears to have been a very rare animal at the time. Now, that's looking at the world of Tyrannosaurus and its immediate precursors. But that's not the entirety of the world of dinosaurs. For instance, in Eurogondwana, at the same time, abelisaurids were the dominant predators. And indeed, for most of dinosaurian history, it was the allosaurids and the megalosauroids, including the spinosaurids, that were the large-bodied predators of the environment, preceded by a phase where it was a collection of primitive theropods. And just to point out here, during the Triassic period, although theropods were present in the late Triassic, they were a minor part of the predatory guild, and instead it was the stem members of the crocodile lineage, things like Postosuchus and Batrachotomus, which were the major predators of their environment, and Carnifex, I should mention, Carnifex as well. Now, when we look at earlier theropod communities, like the Morrison Formation of Western North America from the late Jurassic, we see a very different pattern than we did in the case of the Hell Creek, where we have some exceedingly large predators like Allosaurus and Torvosaurus, but a number of intermediate-sized forms. And unlike in the situation of the Hell Creek, only one of these medium-sized forms, an as yet unnamed member of the ceratosaur group Elaphrosaurinae, seems to have been a non-carnivore. So we have flesh-eating adaptations of intermediate-sized theropods in these late Jurassic, and as we'll see, other communities, these non-tyrannosaurid communities. So what I'm looking at here are what ecologists call guilds, that is, a group that exploits the same class of environmental resources in a similar way. So for instance, we could think about the mammalian predatory guild of the Serengeti, and we would see representatives among the big cats and the canids and the hyenids, each with different strategies in their environment, but often with a major factor that separates them, that partitions their ecological roles based on overall body size, and perhaps some other items like how they acquire prey and the particular prey they're going after. So I've been doing this analysis of a number of theropod guilds over time from the Jurassic and the Cretaceous. Now, sadly, not every formation is equally blessed with fossil discoveries. And so in order to have at least some approach towards statistical rigor, I looked for theropod faunas in which there were 3 or more distinctively different carnivorous theropod species, which were 10 kilograms or larger, and in which there were at least 6 total dinosaurian species. Unfortunately, I had to lose a number of theropod faunas and indeed dinosaurian bearing formations because of this. But when you start dealing with only 2 or 3 species in a community, are you even talking about communities? I would argue you're not. Nevertheless, even under this, these parameters, I wound up with comparable groups of Tyrannosaurid-dominated communities with either Tyrannosaurids or extremely close relatives as the largest known carnivorous taxon. These were all, of course, from Asia America in the late part of the Cretaceous. And then another 30 in which the largest known carnivorous taxon was not a Tyrannosaurid. And this runs from the late part of the early Jurassic of Argentina through the very end of the Cretaceous in India. Now, where possible, where the studies had been done, I didn't just lump all of a formation together, because it turns out most geological formations extend longer than the species durations of the organisms that live within them, at least in particular, the dinosaur species. And therefore, you might be conflating communities that never actually saw each other. So where possible, where there was high resolution biostratigraphy, I subdivided the formations into separate faunal zones. There were only a few cases in which this is possible, but there are some, and I was able to rely on the work of colleagues' research in the past in order to do that. Furthermore, to try to keep from overinflating the number of taxa that lived in any one community, if there were a succession of 2 related taxa that were not overlapping in time, I would treat them as one species. Now, I'm not stating that this is necessarily a case of anagenesis going from Styracosaurus to Pachyrhinosaurus. In fact, I think there's good evidence to suggest it wasn't. But that ecologically, these two centrosaurine horned dinosaurs were playing the same role in the community. And until we find them actually overlapping in time, to treat them as one count in terms of my analysis. So I asked several questions from the populations based on these analyses. The first one was, are the guilds in which tyrannosaurids and their immediate outgroups, in which those are the largest carnivores, are those actually distinct from communities where other taxa are the largest? And just to give you a sense, here are some of the formations that I have from the Tyrannosaurid-dominated communities, and I'll have this green Tyrannophonius to represent Tyrannosaur communities. And down here you see the number of known species of predatory, or rather carnivorous dinosaur, and their size classes. If they're this hatched thing that represents it being a Tyrannosauroid, either a Tyrannosaurid or earlier group, that doesn't actually play a role directly in the counts. It just is to show where they fit in the size ranges. And then the non-Tyrannosaurid dominated communities. And I've got this purple Allosaurus to represent that. And I think you could see just with a quick glance that we see many more intermediate sizes in these formations, and more importantly, that we don't have as many open gaps in these ecosystems. And indeed, that's what I wound up counting here, is counting the number of unoccupied size ranges of the adult dinosaurs, at least, between the smallest carnivorous dinosaur, at least from 10 kilograms or greater, and the largest one in that community. So in here in the upper Hell Creek, we have 3 missing size classes, whereas in the lower Shaxi formation of the Middle Jurassic of China, we don't have any. So is there in fact a statistically significant difference between Tyrannosaurid and non-Tyrannosaurid dominated faunas? And it turns out there is, both in terms of the means and in terms of the medians, that Tyrannosaurid dominated faunas are confirmed to have more missing size classes on average than non-tyrant ones. Now, an immediate thing you might think is, well, maybe we're just undersampling the Tyrannosaurid faunas, but that in fact is not the case. Although there are some of these Tyrannosaurid dominated communities that we definitely need more fossils from, in general, they include some of the best sampled dinosaurian formations of all: the Hell Creek, the Horseshoe Canyon, the Dinosaur Park, the Namek, and so forth. On the flip side, many of the very evenly distributed faunas have had far fewer field seasons. And nevertheless, we pick up many more of these intermediate sizes in those. Well, another question we might ask ourselves is, were these non-tyrant dominated communities, did they have more taxa, more species of these intermediate size ranges, because they had overall greater prey diversity? With the logic being, if we have more types of prey available, that you could partition out these niches much more evenly and therefore have fewer missing size classes. And here we see the data of the non-tyrant in purple and tyrant in green communities with the total number of dinosaur species and the predators as the y-axis. And statistically, it turns out that tyrant-dominated faunas do not have more lower diversity prey than do non-tyrant ones. In fact, arguably the tyrant-dominated communities have more, but it's not statistically significant. So essentially they have the same number of potential prey items. So that's not what's going on. Well, a third possibility is maybe it's the presence of sauropods that allows closer packing of some theropod guilds. And here we see in the succession of faunas within the Morrison Formation, different sauropod species that are known from that formation. Might we argue that? Well, sauropods represent wonderful, tasty food that come packaged all the way from Happy Meal size in terms of eggs and hatchlings, all the way up to the big family bucket size that is the adult. And the logic being that having these animals in your fauna might be able to support a greater diversity of theropods. And it's true that sauropods are rare in most of the tyrant-dominated faunas. In the very latest Cretaceous of Western North America, of Laramidia, we do have a sauropod, Alamosaurus, that's known there. In the Namek Formation of Mongolia, we have a couple sauropods that live side by side with Tarbosaurs. But to be fair, in general, the tyrant-dominated communities are also non-sauropod communities. And by repartitioning up the faunas, it was found that sauropod-lacking faunas were indeed confirmed to have more missing size classes than sauropod-present communities. Not a huge surprise, given that sauropod-lacking faunas are almost, but not exactly, the same thing as tyrant-dominated communities. Of course, this points to an unsolved mystery, and it is unsolved. We currently don't have the data to resolve this. Which happened first? Was it that sauropods went extinct or became rare in the middle of the late Cretaceous of Asia America, and their predators, the allosaurids, I should have said, went with them, giving an opportunity for the ancestral tyrannosauroids to expand into giant form? Or did the tyrannosaurids expand to giant form within Tyrannosauroidea, wiping out sauropods locally and allosauroids regionally? And we don't know. We just don't know. We don't have the right formations for it. We do know that in the early to middle part of the late Cretaceous of Western North America and Eastern and Central Asia, we have these transitional tyrannosauroids that show some of the adaptations that we associate with the later tyrannosaurids at a much smaller body size and in communities where allosauroids were still the dominant predators. Now, my hypothesis is that the juvenile and subadult tyrannosaurids had assimilated, that is, taken over the vacant niche of the medium-sized predators in previous communities. Not to say that they drove them out necessarily, but they were at least occupying those spots. So if we look in the dinosaur park formation, we see those missing size classes in terms of adult sizes, but there are individuals of young tyrannosaurids that occupy those spots perfectly fine, shown all here to scale. Now, niche assimilation is a term proposed by my friend and colleague Mike Brett-Sermon in his studies of ornithopod dinosaurs. And in his context, he referred to this as the observation that large dinosaurs pass through multiple orders of magnitudes and thus take on what are effectively multiple niches in other faunas of non-dinosaurian animals throughout their ontogeny. So by comparison with the Serengeti today, where we run from hoofed mammals of dictic size through various other antelope to horses to rhinos and giraffes all the way up to plains elephants, you could have one species of dinosaur occupying all those niches, in this case, Edmontosaurus annectens. And indeed, Mike Brett-Sermon has suggested that this is one of the reasons that dinosaurian assemblages had a smaller total species count than do many good Cenozoic mammalian assemblages, because each dinosaur species is effectively multiple ecologies. So that's the general niche assimilation idea. In my particular variant on it, the Tyrannosaurid one, it is that the Tyrannosaurids were ecologically operating as the medium-sized theropods that had existed in earlier communities. Now, one implication is that we might expect ontogenetically rapid and extreme transformations representing these niche shifts as they're going from exploiting one set of resources at one size to another. And indeed, we've seen how bite forces, agility, and speed versus endurance are quite different from small body size to large size. My colleague, Tom Carr, over the course of many years and culminating in his great monograph last year, showed how we could plot the chronological age of Tyrannosaurus Rex against its body size or a number of other factors and see how rapidly it goes from body forms characterized by individuals like Jane through a very short period of time to those characterized by our classic adult tyrannosaurids. And so in an ecological sense, they go from being one species to another species, even though taxonomically it's just the same species. This is not a unique trait to dinosaurs. Indeed, ecological studies of the Komodo dragon shows that rather than going through a gradual series of ecological roles, Varanus komodoensis basically has a rapid transition from being a small prey eater to a large prey eater, with a small home range to a large home range, and so forth. Now, we unfortunately do not yet have a great amount of data on the ontogenetic changes in non-tyrannosaurid dinosaurs. One of the wonderful aspects of Laramidian fossil sites is that we have got a lot of growth stages of lots of individuals of many species, and therefore they have been the subject of a lot of work. And we don't have those data yet for many of the early Cretaceous and Jurassic sites. It's worth pointing out that very recently, a study looking at the growth of one individual of giant Allosauroid showed that unlike a Tyrannosaurid, its growth rate was relatively slower and it didn't show as rapid a transformation, at least with regard to size. Now, sadly, we don't have the younger individuals known to see what morphological changes and therefore potentially ecological changes they were going through. Now, I speculate that when better known, the latest Cretaceous Gondwanan communities might show something similar to what we see in terms of the Tyrannosaurid communities. And the justification for that is when you get to the very late part of the late Cretaceous in Argentina and various other parts of the world, we see a similar pattern to what we have in Laramidia and in Eastern and Central Asia, with one apex predator and then some small-bodied forms, but not much in between. In this case, it's a Balesaurids, or in some cases, Megaraptorans, as the apex predator, rather than Tyrannosaurids. But unfortunately, these faunas are at present less well sampled, and the ontogeny of the taxa involved, of the species involved, is only preliminarily done. Although, to be fair, it is beginning to be done. Here's a reference of looking, one such paper looking at ontogeny in Majungasaurus, an Abelisaurid of the later Cretaceous of Madagascar. So my plea is, yes, I know everyone wants to work on Tyrannosaurs. They're awesome. I totally get it. If anyone on the planet gets it, I get it. But these other sorts of dinosaurs need love too, both collecting new specimens and going into the collections and examining young individuals of these earlier groups and non-Asian American groups of theropods. All right, so that brings us to the end of my presentation. I do want to say Tyrannosaurus Rex can continue to help us out by reminding us that the pandemic is still ongoing. And make sure when you have the opportunity to get your vaccinations, and make sure you follow all the appropriate protocols to keep this virus from keeping us apart more than necessary. And I especially want to thank Eric Snively, Haley O'Brien, Donald Henderson, and Andre Rowe for use of their slides that represented the middle section. That was our work on the agility of large-bodied theropods. They did those wonderful computer graphics slides. And again, I want to thank the Currie Museum for inviting me to give this talk. I do plan on getting out there when I can and see your new facility. In the meantime, thank you for putting on this virtual speaker series. It's a great help for researchers to be able to communicate with new friends and old, to get our research across, and for the public to learn what's going on in the latest studies from the people actually doing them. If you have any questions that you haven't asked yet in YouTube, you can email me. You can check out my website, and I'm on Twitter at Tom Holtz Paleo. I have paleo at the end of that. You know, one thing I learned early on, if you put that in there, you're going to get a lot of people into the paleo diet. who are going to follow you for a while. I don't think any of them stay because I don't say much about it. If my advice in terms of the paleo diet is to pin something down and rip out huge chunks of living flesh with incrassate dentition and a solidified secondary palate, I don't think that's particularly helpful. So thank you for coming, and I look forward to your questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Holtz. So we are going to move on to our question period. And if anyone has any questions, just type them into the YouTube chat bar and I will read them aloud to Dr. Holtz. Our first question comes from Ross Grundler. Could the forelimbs of adolescent tyrannosaurs have been larger relative to adults so that they may have used them for hunting?
Yes, that might be a possibility. Now, we don't yet have anyone who's really worked too much on the mechanics of these forelimbs, but it's definitely something worth pursuing. There are some Gorgosaurus and Albertosaurus specimens, Tarbosaurus as well, for which we've got the forelimbs of young individuals. Of course, Jane has not quite a complete one, but a pretty good forelimb. And famously, the new specimen, the so-called dueling dinosaur specimen, has the best forelimb of any North American tyrannosaurid so far. And we're looking forward to that being fully studied. And that can give us a sense of how that might be used to acquire prey, or even if it's not the first approach to get prey, maybe to help dispatch it, maybe to hold down the prey. Of course, it's worth noting that forelimbs can be used for many other things, including display and so forth. But given the size of the claws as proportion to the body of young tyrannosaurids, I suspect they probably were still functional in some sort of prey acquisition context. Great question.
Yeah. Next question comes from J. Park Lover, aka Robert Fonderson. Would Jane and other juveniles go up against and possibly suffer injuries from pachycephalosaurs?
That's a great question. Pachycephalosaurus itself, these are the dome-headed dinosaurs. Pachycephalosaurus and its closest relatives, if Stygimoloch is not Pachycephalosaurus, it's probably its closest relatives. Those are fairly sizable dinosaurs. And so an adult one of those might potentially, at least head-on, represent a threat. And whether those big domes were used primarily for within-species display or combat, when you're being attacked by a tyrannosaur, they're going to be used defensively, particularly when you have stumpy leg proportions compared to a speed demon like a young tyrannosaurid. So they might potentially have some threat from those larger ones bashing into them, at least unless they can get around and take them out from the sides. But it's worth noting that most pachycephalosaurids, other than Stygimoloch and Pachycephalosaurus, are quite small dinosaurs. Indeed, in general, pachycephalosaurids are one of the few groups of famous, non-bird dinosaurs where the average type is much smaller than a human being. And those I don't think would represent much of a threat.
Very well said. I think Mermaid Labs predicted what you were going to say and asked, are the missing size classes in Tyrannosaurid-dominated fauna filled in by the younger juvenile tyrant individuals? That was great.
Yeah, great prediction. And indeed, that is the hypothesis that I'm working under. So,
excellent. Raphael Hintz, may I ask if there's any proposed model for Carcharodontosaurian-dominated ecosystems? Why would juvenile and subadult Carcharodontosaurians were not taking the medium theropod niche?
Right. So that's the thing. Of course, the other giant theropod dinosaurs do have to go through the same size range, and therefore ecologically we're distinct in some ways from the adult. But in those communities, there are already other types of theropods, whether they're abelisauroids or piatnitskysaurids or primitive tyrannosauroids or what have you, that are already specialists at those body sizes. And so it might be, and unfortunately we don't know the ontogeny of these forms that well, that you wouldn't have necessarily particular suites of adaptations that are specializations at these intermediate body sizes on the part of the giants, the way we see a distinctly different shape overall for a young tyrant versus an adult tyrant. There would be differences. There would be allometric changes, of course, changes in bite force, but they might not be as ecologically different from the big guys as a Tyrannosaurid is. Of course, the proof of this would be in finding more of these specimens, and unfortunately, we don't have those yet, which is why we need to keep looking.
Well said. Mason Hintermeister, this niche assimilation is an interesting concept, something I'd like to look for in other fossil animals.
Yes, yes, and this is one of the ways I think that it makes that dinosaurs are distinctly different from their ecological equivalents today, which in most of the world are big placental mammals. We can make some gross comparisons between say big hoofed mammals and hadrosaurs or ceratopsians and so forth. But in terms of their ontogeny, in terms of their life history strategy, dinosaurs were radically different. And indeed, there was a great paper that came out back in the 90s by Matt Carano, who was, I believe at the time, an undergraduate, although now is, of course, the curator of dinosaurs at the Smithsonian, and Christine Janis, that I thought, when I first read it, I said, this really gets, to some of the ways the world of dinosaurs was different. And that is, in a dinosaur community, first of all, you can reproduce like gangbusters. Not that gangbusters reproduce a lot. You reproduce like weeds because you're having these big clutches of eggs. That also means that you're going to have much more massive mortality between any individual clutch and adulthood than you would expect in a placental mammal, which is investing a lot more resources into a lot fewer young. And also that those babies are tiny animals. So it's not just for theropods. A baby sauropod is an animal that you could kick around, which you shouldn't do because don't kick animals. Not that you've got the option of kicking around sauropods. But a baby sauropod is an animal that could fit inside basically a soccer ball or so, and an adult is the mass of a herd of elephants. So it can't help but being ecologically many different sorts of forms. And in contrast, an African elephant, when newborn, is already one of the most massive animals on the Serengeti plains. It's already 100 kilograms or so. And is already bigger than many of the other plant eaters in its environment. And of course, in the case of placental mammals, there's often long-term provisioning of young from not merely birth, but almost all the way to adult size. I mean, we've all probably seen those nature shows of cheetahs raising their young, and the young males and young females are with the mom until they're a substantial fraction of adult body size, at which point they're already being able to prey on at least some of the smaller antelope and spring hares and so forth. And it looks like your typical theropod dinosaur, that wasn't probably true, that they were on their own hunting frogs and baby dinosaurs and so forth from an early age and biding their time and hopefully not dying until they could go and take on the big guys.
Well answered. This question comes from Kat Schrader, I believe.
Oh, hi.
How do you think the radiation of Ornithischian dinosaurs may have pushed the evolution of specialization, heavy skulls, etc., in adult tyrannosaurs, if at all?
Yes, this is an excellent question. And again, this transition takes place in that gap in time, or we're beginning to get sense of that. I had a picture back there which showed the Suskityrannus, this Turonian, that is mid-late Cretaceous form of Tyrannosaurid. And in the background was Zuniceratops, which is a precursor of the classic horned dinosaurs, and Jawadia, which was a precursor of the duckbills. So you got this like proto version of the late Cretaceous fauna. And I suspect there are a lot of big changes with regards to the interaction, the coevolution of an Ornithischian, in particular, a horned dinosaur and duckbill dinosaur dominated fauna herbivores and tyrannosaurids. That we're dealing with ornithischians that have bigger brains, and I know that's damned by faint praise, but bigger brains than stegosaurs and sauropods, for which there is signs of much more complex gregarious behavior and social interactions, both from these mass herd sites in both hadrosaurids and duckbills, and also a lot of their display structures, which suggests they probably had complex within species interactions in a way that maybe a sauropod didn't. And so there are probably a lot of differences in terms of this, in terms of food acquisition, of course, these big-headed ornithischians compared to these tiny-headed gut-processing sauropods. So yeah, there's a big story there going on of the interaction of all those forms. And since I'm already rambling, I should add into that, and probably the change of the flora. You know, it might well be that as flora is changing, that we're getting a big transition. It's worth noting that Asia America is almost exactly contiguous with a particular floral province, a pollen province, but a suite of plants called the Aquila pollinites flora. And wouldn't it be cool if it turned out that there's some difference in overall maybe primary productivity of the Aquila pollinites flora versus the Normopolis fauna versus there's even a floral or there's a pollen distinction between those parts of Gondwana in which abelisaurids are the largest predators and megaraptorans are the largest predators at the end of the Cretaceous. So yeah, we are not running out of new topics to explore anytime soon.
Thank goodness. Arian Chow, would an ecosystem dominated by early large tyrannosaurs such as Utatyranus have a similar guild structure to the ones dominated by later tyrannosaurs?
Right. Now, one of the big problems with our study of Utatyranus at the moment is we don't exactly know when it's from. And we know it's from the Ixian Formation, but it's from an unpublished site that has never been described. It apparently includes a sauropod, and I think a big iguanodontian is reported in the Utatyranus paper, but those haven't been further elaborated on. And we don't know exactly where within the 11 million year, whatever it is, range of the Ixian Formation, 6 million range, whatever it is, I have to go look at the number of the Ixian Formation to know what's there. And there's this massively annoying taphonomic filter that is selectivity in what's getting preserved in the Jahol biota, this assemblage of fossils in the Ixian Formation and the Jeju Photong above that, where we're getting this phenomenal data of the little guys, far more than we know about for the rest of the Mesozoic, but almost nothing of the big guys. We don't have what we call fluvio-lacustrine deposits, the stream and lake deposits, which are great for preserving giant dinosaurs and lousy for preserving the articulated specimens of little guys. So we know excellent stuff about the little guys and only a tiny bit about the big guys. So we don't really know what the ecological structure in the world of Utatyranus was like. And indeed, I suspect we are going to find that Utatyranus, big as it is not the apex predator of its environment, because in rocks below and rocks above, it's Carcharodontosaurs that are the largest theropods, or neovenatorids. And I suspect that's what we're going to find when we know more about the large-bodied forms in the same time as the Ixian Formation in northeastern China.
Very good point. Giovanni R. would like to say hello from Bolivia.
Hello.
And Lorenzo Ciderini says ciao from Italy.
Ah, ciao.
Illiterate scholar asked about Raptor-Rex.
Okay, so yes. Raptor-Rex is this little specimen initially marketed, and I have to say that because it was on a market, as being a specimen of Electrosaurus. And indeed, when I first saw a photograph, it's finally, so Electrosaurus was the first discovered small-sized, clearly Tyrannosaurid relative from the early part of the late Cretaceous of Mongolia, well, northern China in this case. So that was described as that, and then it finally got acquired and described. No, they described it under a new name. There's a big question as to, well, it almost certainly is a juvenile, that much we know.
Mm-hmm.
But a juvenile what? Is it a very small individual of Tarbosaurus, as some people think?
Mm-hmm.
Good question. Is it a juvenile of a Tyrannosaur for which we don't have the adult? Maybe. Is it in fact freaking Electrosaurus? That would be awesome. But we don't know. And sadly, given the fact that its provenance, that is the data we have for where it was collected, is sort of the Tucson Rock Show. And before that, it's fuzzy, and I don't mean in a proto-feather way, we can't really put it into context. And people have pointed out, initially it was described as being from the late part of the early Cretaceous, but other workers suggest, no, it's from the Nemegt Formation that contains Tarbosaurus, tens of millions of years younger. So yeah, great skeleton, but fossils require context. And this is an example of that. It looks great, but fossil hunting should not be trophy hunting. It should be science.
Very true. Robert Fonderson just wanted to say thanks, Tom, for sharing the Tyrannosaur talk in the groups.
Oh, great, sure.
Yeah, and Mitchell Carber also said thank you very much for the lecture. Graham
Great.
Hopkins, he's saying a fantastic presentation. Thank you. I immediately recognized your voice from the many dinosaur documentaries you appeared in that I loved in my childhood.
Oh, great. Glad to hear.
Yeah. Lots of thank yous. Eric Scott, Ross Grundler. Kat has a follow-up.
Oh, great.
Specifically, I'm thinking of the morphological similarity between
Apalachosaurus?
Yeah, man. And juvenile T-Rex and multi-generational herds of Ornithischians.
Yeah, that's a good question. Now we don't, sadly, we don't know as much about Apalachosaurus's the rest of that community. For all the reasons that we talked about before, and I mentioned before that our sampling in the eastern part of North America is nothing like it is in the Great Badlands. And for all we know, there were herds of Eotrachodon, which is one of the big contemporary hadrosaurs or hadrosauroids from that same region that it could have been going after. But we don't know yet. And we don't know what ceratopsians, if any, were there that early. We know that at the very end, chasmosaurines had made it over to eastern North America, but that may be due to the Maastrichtian regression, the draining of the seaway.
Mm.
So yeah, it actually might be the case that these big multi-generation herds of Ornithischians may offset the loss of sauropods. That instead of having one individual, individuals that go from the fun meal, the happy meal, to the family bucket size, you've got these large agglomerations of individuals that might not get as gigantic, but there's a lot comparable amounts or maybe even more biomass available, and many of them are more easily accessible to a reasonable sized carnivorous animal, since a very large sauropod is probably something that wasn't preyed upon by very many things at all.
That reoccurring analogy that you keep bringing up is just perfect.
Oh, great.
Illiterate scholar, is the differing forelimb size between young and adults also seen in Tarbosaurus?
Yes, although not to the same degree, because Tarbosaurus actually has the most reduced forelimbs of any Tyrannosaurid currently studied. That the proportional size of the forelimb in both adult and in young Tarbosaurus is smaller than you would find in a comparable sized individual of Tyrannosaurus or Albertosaurus or Gorgosaurus or Daspletosaurus. And additionally, in Tarbosaurus, metacarpal 3, the non-finger-bearing metacarpal in the hand, is the smallest of all in Tyrannosaurids. And it's basically suggesting that it's in the Tarbosaurus lineage that the hand's becoming the most useless. So, you know, maybe Tyrannosaurus made jokes about Tarbosaurus's hands. I don't know.
Another question from Robert Fonderson. While T-Rex teeth were built for biting armored prey, could their teeth puncture the hide of Alamosaurus instead of the slice and tear strategy of shark tooth of Carnosaurus?
Okay, that's a good question. Presumably, it could still puncture through the hide, and indeed, there are specimens of Alamosaurus that show Tyrannosaurid, and in fact, presumably Tyrannosaurus, bite marks on it. That's not to say we know that the Tyrannosaurus had killed that Alamosaurus, but certainly that it was feeding on it. And if it's feeding on it, it suggests that its teeth can get through there. Additionally, the work by Gignac and Erickson finds something like, what was it, 2 gigapascals or something of force at the larger teeth at the point of contact. And I don't know that there's any skin that's ever evolved that might be able to withstand that. So it would be a different type of bite than the slice and bite, the bite and slice action of an Allosauride. But I'm reasonably secure that a Tyrannosaurid could, rip open into these forms. And, presumably, and this has been speculated on by people in the past, and there's no way of really demonstrating this without a time machine, but, disabling bites are probably what you would go for if you were taking on a large sauropod. Take out a big chunk of the limb or go after the neck to the point that it can't move around anymore, and then you can find an easier point of access.
Absolutely. Annie McIntosh just wanted to say hi from Edmonton. Thanks for the great
Hello.
talk, Tom. Ecogenic, hi also from Edmonton. Aaron Van Der East, hey Thomas. What are your thoughts on where the large Tyrannosaurians were during the latest Campanian and earliest Maastrichtian of North America after Daspletosaurus, but prior to Tyrannosaurus?
Yeah, that's a good question. And just to put that into perspective for those who don't know all these details, the early Maastrichtian, that is the time of the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, which is where Drumheller, Alberta is, and so forth. So after the Great Dinosaur Park Formation and prior to the Hell Creek Formation, in the Horseshoe Canyon, we don't have good evidence of big members of the Tyrannosaurus, Daspletosaurus, Tarbosaurus, Lythronax subfamily, the Tyrannosaurinae. And so where were they? Because they were there earlier in the form of Daspletosaurus. One place they might have been, maybe they were just gone locally, ecologically. Why they would have gone? Very difficult to say. They may have still been present in the Southwest. Lythronax is the oldest of the Tyrannosaurines. It's older even than the ones in Asia, and it's present in the Southwest. So there could have been members of that lineage down there. But most of the recent phylogenies, the recent family tree studies, have put Tyrannosaurus as most closely related to Tarbosaurus and to Zhucheng Tyrannus, which are both from Eastern and Central Asia. And so some people refer to Tyrannosaurus as a recent arrival into North America at that time. It's certainly a reasonable hypothesis, but I think what we really need to be more secure in that is to have comparable representation of faunas, in Southern Laramidia, Central Laramidia, Northern Laramidia, Northern Asia, and Central Asia for each of these time slices to know who's present where. Because what we have are we have some knowns and then a bunch of question marks where we don't have the fossils. And so we don't know who was living there at that time. And so we're probably missing a lot of the bigger picture of the biogeography. And we do know that there are plenty of the other dinosaurs in the Hell Creek Formation, the latest Cretaceous of Western North America, that have close relatives in Asia. So Edmontosaurus, who is present in the Hell Creek, and to be fair, in the Horseshoe Canyon, its close cousins are over in Asia. The Pachycephalosaurus has close cousins over there, and Ankylosaurus has close cousins over there. And I think thinking of Asia and America as separate places isn't always the right thing to think about at that time. That's part of one big, subcontinent. Basically it's Asia with this Lyramidian peninsula coming off of it.
Yes. Elam H just wanted to say, cool hearing you. Thanks for the Coelosaurian and Tyrannosaurs video in my Dino class at Carleton.
Oh, great, thanks.
Lorenzo Ciderini, I've known both Dr. Holtz and Dr. Currie since I was 8 and watched Jurassic Fight Club. I've grown to realize that show is garbage, but I'm glad it introduced me to you and the other scientists.
I will say this for Jurassic Fight Club. No one was surprised about it going into it. We were told it was called Jurassic Fight Club. We came in with our eyes wide open as to the type of show it would be. And they treated the scientists in this on the project really well. And they gave us a lot of chance to actually say complete sentences and so forth. And not all documentary teams, at least in the past, have been so good about that. So that said, yeah, it's not the sort of source I would go to necessarily for the details of paleontological science. Although if you want a dinosaur fight, or even more so, some of the other fights between creatures that don't normally get animated, it's your best source for that outside of a video game.
Oh my gosh, yeah. This is good chat. Mermaid Labs wants to say what a privilege. Not only wonderful info, but you've had me laughing the whole time. What better way to learn? Thank you. Similarly.
Great.
Lorenzo Ciderini, I feel like when someone manages to make the audience feel their enthusiasm about the subject they're talking about, something magical happens.
Thank you.
Mark W. Hi, Tom. It's nice to finally have the science behind what we have been championing for some years. In effect, Tyrannosaurids were extraordinarily efficient predators throughout ontogeny. Who knew? We knew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Christian VH, thank you for the great talk, Thomas. Just to know, do you think it is likely that there are records of large Longarostrian tyrannosaurs, examples similar to Alioramus in North America?
That's a good question. So for those who aren't aware of this, there's a subgroup of tyrannosaurids called the Alioramines. These, as the name suggests, have rather proportionally long snouts, and actually proportionally shallow snouts is also a big aspect of it, that presumably had a much weaker bite. They're known from China and Mongolia. We don't directly have individuals of them yet in North America. No reason to think they couldn't have been here, but we don't have any direct evidence of them. So who knows? That's why we go out and A, dig up new bones, and B, go back to old collections and relook at it. For all we know, in some collection, there's a mislabeled specimen that's part of an Alioramine snout from the Hell Creek or the Dinosaur Park or something. Or maybe they didn't get over here. There definitely are some ecological differences between Lyramidia and the rest of Asia America. For instance, the horned dinosaurs don't seem to have very much presence in Asia. We've got Sinoceratops, and by this I mean Ceratopsidae, the true horned dinosaurs. We have Sinoceratops over there, but very little else. Whereas, you go to the Hell Creek, the Dinosaur Park, the Horseshoe Canyon, you're sometimes tripping over horned dinosaurs. And in contrast to North America, we have almost no evidence of latest Cretaceous Therizinosaurs. These are these big sloth-like, long-necked herbivorous theropods. They're fairly common in Mongolia and China at that time. So there definitely are some differences. And So it could be that oleoramines were staying in Asia. Who knows? Maybe they're Therizinosaur eating specialists. You heard it here first. So yeah, we don't know.
Good point. Jason Gilchrist, fascinating talk and answers. Thank you, Tom, for sharing your thoughts on dinosaur ecology and comparisons with contemporary ecosystems. Great science in there and lots of gaps to fill.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. Yes, absolutely.
So it doesn't look like there's any more questions coming in. I think, yeah, we're going to wrap up question period. Thank you again so much, Dr. Holtz. Really appreciate your time.
Great.
For those of you watching, join us again Saturday, April 24th at 12 p.m. as Filippo Bertozzo will be calling in from Italy to present his talk titled Pathologies Out of Time, Fossilized Lesions and Diseases in Hadrosaurs and Their Significance. It aligns with his new discovery on a specimen from the Royal Ontario Museum. That's going to be a good one.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you again, Dr. Holtz, and thank you to everybody for joining in. Take care.
Take care, everyone.